Before you sleep tonight, I want you to think about something. Somewhere in a museum archive, perhaps in Philadelphia, perhaps in London, perhaps in Berlin, there sits a circular piece of clay or stone. It's been there for decades, catalogued, photographed, studied. But what if that circle contains more than what the museum label tells you? What if its very shape is the message? Comment below. Where are you listening from tonight? A bedroom in Tokyo? A car in California? A quiet room in London? Wherever you are, you're about to trace a pattern that began nearly 5,000 years ago, preserved in 4 circles that shouldn't exist together, yet somehow tell the same story. The first circle measures 10 inches across, alabaster, pale as moonlight, carved around 2300 BCE. It sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum under catalogue number B16665. On its face, a procession, 4 figures approaching a stepped altar. One figure wears the flounced robe of a high priestess. Above her, carved in cuneiform so precise it could have been inscribed yesterday, 2 words, Enhedu Anna, the world's first named author, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. But this disc is not a portrait, it's a record. The second circle is older than you'd think and younger than it appears. Fragment K8538 in the British Museum, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh from the library of King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BC. 5 inches in diameter, pressed into clay when it was soft, then baked until it became stone. The surface is divided into 8 wedge-shaped sections radiating from a central point, each section filled with cuneiform notations, each notation marking a star, a constellation, a celestial event. The museum calls it a planisphere, the oldest known map of the night sky. The sky over Nineveh on January 3rd, 650 BC to be precise. Modern astronomers have verified this. They took the notation, compared it to computer models of ancient star positions, and found a match. The person who made this tablet was recording what they actually saw. But the tablet itself asks a question the museum label doesn't answer. How did they know to divide the sky into 8 parts? Who taught them that heaven could be sectioned like a pie chart, that the movements of celestial bodies could be predicted, recorded, preserved for kings who would not be born for centuries? The third circle sits in the same museum just a few rooms away. Catalogue number BM 92687. The Babylonian map of the world. Some call it Imago Mundi, the image of everything. 600 years before the Common Era, perhaps 500, someone pressed a stylus into clay and drew a circle. Inside the circle, Babylon, marked as a rectangle, the Euphrates River running through it. 7 cities, 7 regions, each labelled in cuneiform. Around the circle, a ring labelled Maratu, the bitter river, the cosmic ocean that encircles all known land. Beyond the bitter river, triangular regions extending outward, mythological places, regions where, according to the cuneiform text inscribed above the map, the sun is not seen, where ancient heroes travelled, where the gods once walked. In August 2024, Dr. Irving Finkel of the British Museum published his translation of the text that accompanies this map. One passage describes a great ship, a journey across the bitter river, a landing on a distant shore. The dimensions of the ship match, almost exactly, the dimensions given in the Babylonian flood story. The same ship that appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same ship that echoes in Genesis. This wasn't a map for travellers. It was a map of theological geography, a diagram of how the Babylonians understood the structure of reality itself, and they drew it as a circle. The fourth object is the most controversial, cylinder seal VA243 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, Akkadian period, roughly contemporary with Enhedu Anna's disc. When you roll a cylinder seal across soft clay, it creates a continuous frieze, a story told in repeated images. VA243 shows a seated figure, probably a deity or king. Before him, a standing figure in supplication. Between them, what appears to be a staff or sceptre. And above the scene, in the upper left corner, a star surrounded by 11 smaller dots. In 1976, a researcher named Zecharia Sitchin published a book claiming this seal depicted our solar system, the central star representing the Sun, the 11 dots representing planets including a supposed 12th planet called Nibiru, home of the Anunnaki. Mainstream scholars immediately rejected this interpretation. The iconography, they said, was standard for the period, a star representing the divine, dots representing other celestial deities, nothing more. But here's what nobody disputes. The seal exists. The dots are there, and whoever carved it chose to arrange them in a circle around a central point. That choice was deliberate. That choice meant something. 4 circles, 4 artifacts, 4 different time periods, 4 different functions, 4 different museums. Yet they share something beyond their shape. Each one claims, in its own way, to preserve knowledge that came from above, from the heavens, from the gods, from the Anunnaki, who, according to the oldest texts, decreed the fates of mankind. The Disk of Enheduanna doesn't just commemorate a priestess. The cuneiform inscription identifies her as the one who made the temples resound with hymns, hymns to celestial deities, hymns that tracked the movements of Venus, hymns that synchronized earthly ritual with cosmic cycles. The planisphere K8538 doesn't just record stars. It divides the sky according to a system that appears, fully formed, in texts like Mul, Apin, an astronomical compendium that describes itself as preserving the decisions of the gods Anu and Enlil, 2 of the 7 great Anunnaki who formed the Cosmic Council. The Babylonian world map doesn't just show cities. Its accompanying text describes knowledge passed down through the ages, knowledge of distant lands, knowledge encoded in stories about gods and heroes who bridge the gap between heaven and earth. And VA243, whatever it actually depicts, places its figures beneath a celestial canopy. The seal's message, preserved in miniature, meant to be stamped over and over into clay documents, is that earthly authority flows from cosmic arrangement. That above and below are connected. That the pattern holds. Tonight, you're going to hear the story these circles tell when you place them side by side, not as isolated artifacts from a dead civilization, but as chapters in a single narrative about how knowledge moved from the divine realm to human hands, about why the Mesopotamians chose circles to preserve their most important secrets, about what it meant when priests and scribes claimed the Anunnaki had taught them to read the heavens. You'll hear about a library that burned in 612 BC, preserving its contents by accident, about a king who collected every tablet dealing with celestial omens because he believed his fate was written in the stars, about a priestess astronomer who watched Venus rise and set, recording its movements in hymns that doubled as astronomical tables, about a flood story encoded in a map, about texts that describe divine beings descending to teach humanity the art of divination, the secret of heaven and earth. But first, you need to understand who the Anunnaki were according to the people who wrote their names in clay, not modern theories, not ancient alien speculation. What the texts themselves actually say about this divine council who supposedly came down from heaven and who, the records claim, established the cosmic order. The story begins not with artifacts, but with words, with the oldest royal inscription we have, with a phrase that appears again and again in Sumerian literature, carved into temple foundations, pressed into clay tablets, copied and recopied for over 2,000 years. When kingship descended from heaven, that's where we start. Because before there were circles to preserve the knowledge, there were gods who supposedly granted it. And their story, according to the scribes of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon and Assyria, is written in those circles still. Close your eyes if you can, let the screen dim. We're going back to the beginning, to the moment when the Mesopotamians claimed that knowledge itself came down from the sky, carried by beings they called the Anunnaki, the offspring of heaven and earth, the ones who decreed fates, the council whose decisions shaped everything that followed. The circles are waiting. The story they tell has been waiting for centuries, and it begins with a question these ancient scribes asked themselves. If the gods gave us knowledge, why did they choose circles to preserve it? Let's find out. When kingship descended from heaven. There's a line that appears in the Weld Blundell prism, a clay object about 8 inches tall, inscribed on all 4 sides with columns of cuneiform text. It's housed now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, catalogue number AN 1923.444. The clay was pressed and baked around 1800 BC during the first dynasty of Essene, but the text it preserves is far older. This is a copy of a copy, part of a scribal tradition that stretched back at least to the Year 3 period, perhaps earlier still. The prism is what we call the Sumerian king list. It's a chronological account of every king who ruled in Mesopotamia, organised by city, recording how long each dynasty held power before kingship was smitten with weapons or overthrown and moved to another city. But before it lists any human king, before it names Elulim of Eridu, or Allogar of Bad Tabira, or any of the antediluvian rulers with their impossibly long reigns, it begins with a single statement. Namlugal Antadadabar, when kingship descended from heaven, not established, not invented, not developed through social evolution, descended from an heaven, the cosmic realm, the domain of the gods, to key, earth, the human world, the place where cities were built and fields were planted and scribes learnt their craft. This wasn't poetic language. This was theological fact, repeated across thousands of tablets, embedded in hymns and epics and administrative texts. Kingship, political authority, the right to rule, the power to decree laws, came from above. It was granted by the assembly of gods, specifically by the great Anunnaki, whose very name encodes this concept. Anunnaki. In Sumerian, Anunnaki. In Akkadian, Anunnaki or Anunnaki. The etymology isn't perfectly clear, and scholars still debate it, but the most widely accepted reading breaks it down as follows. Anu plus Lunar, princely seed, plus Kir, the princely offspring of heaven and earth, the children of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess, beings who belong to both realms, who bridged the cosmic and terrestrial, who could move between heaven and the assembly hall, between the divine council and the human throne room. They were not demons, they were not angels, they were gods, but not the gods of individual cities or specific natural phenomena. They were the administrative tier of the divine hierarchy, the council, the legislators of the cosmos. In the earliest Sumerian texts from the mid-3rd millennium BC, the Anunnaki appear as a collective body. They are the great Anunnaki, the Anunnaki of the land, the Anunnaki who decree fates. They sit in assembly, they make decisions, they judge cases brought before them, and their primary function, stated explicitly in text after text, is to establish me, the divine decrees, the fundamental principles that govern existence. Me is a difficult concept to translate. It's not quite law, because it includes things like priesthood, kingship, music, sexual intercourse, craftsmanship, truth-telling. It's not quite natural law, because it includes cultural institutions. Perhaps the closest English equivalent is cosmic ordinance, the fundamental patterns that make civilization possible, that structure reality itself, that separate order from chaos. The Anunnaki decreed the me. This is their function. This is why they mattered to the Sumerians, to the Akkadians, to the Babylonians, who inherited and adapted these traditions. Every king who sat on a throne in Mesopotamia claimed to rule because the Anunnaki had decreed it. Every temple ritual was valid because the Anunnaki had established the pattern. Every scribe who learned cuneiform was accessing knowledge the Anunnaki had given to humanity through intermediaries. Who were these intermediaries? How did the Anunnaki communicate with humans if they belonged to the celestial realm? The texts give us names. The highest council, sometimes called the seven who decree fate, consisted of An, the sky itself, Enlil, the air, the executive authority, Enki, the sweet waters beneath the earth, wisdom and craft, Ninhursag, the mountain, the mother of gods, Nana, the moon, Utu, the sun, and Inanna. These seven formed the inner circle, the highest court. Their decisions were final. Their decrees shaped cosmic destiny, but beneath them, the term Anunnaki referred to a much larger group. In the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, written down in the first millennium BC, but drawing on far older traditions, the god Marduk receives authority over 600 Anunnaki, 300 stationed in heaven, 300 assigned to the underworld. This vast bureaucracy wasn't meant literally. It was a way of expressing totality, completeness. The Anunnaki were the divine government, the cosmic civil service, the administrative structure of reality, and they met in council. Tablet after tablet describes this assembly. In the Atrahasis epic, they gathered to decide the fate of humanity. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they deliberate on the flood. In countless hymns, they are invoked as witnesses to royal decrees. Before the great Anunnaki, in the assembly of the gods, when the Anunnaki had taken their seats, this assembly operated according to principles that would be familiar to any bureaucracy. There were hierarchies, there were procedures. Decisions required consensus, or at least the agreement of the seven who held veto power. Enlil, as the chief executive, could convene the assembly, but even he couldn't overrule the collective judgment. And crucially, the assembly met in a specific location, not in some abstract spiritual heaven, but in Nippur, modern Nafar in Iraq. Located about 100 miles south of Baghdad, the religious centre of Sumer, the site that every Mesopotamian dynasty, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, claimed as sacred, neutral territory. No king ruled from Nippur. It was the city of the gods, specifically the city of Enlil. And within Nippur, the temple complex called Ekkur, the mountain house. The University of Pennsylvania conducted extensive excavations at Nippur between 1889 and 1900, then resumed work in the 1960s. They recovered approximately 30,000 tablets, many fragmentary, many still being translated. Among these tablets are countless references to the Anunnaki's assembly at Ekkur. Hymns describe how the Anunnaki bowed down before Enlil in Nippur. Administrative texts record offerings for the great Anunnaki. Temple inventories list shrines maintained for the seven who decree fates. This is where the circularity begins, not in the shape of artifacts yet, but in the concept of the Cosmic Council, because the Anunnaki's assembly operated in cycles. They met at appointed times. They rendered judgments that held for specific periods. They renewed the me annually, and humans tracked these cycles through observation of the heavens, through the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets, through the rising and setting of star groups that the Mesopotamians called Mul, the stars, the constellations. The connection between the Anunnaki Council and celestial observation wasn't accidental. The gods themselves were celestial bodies, or more precisely, celestial bodies were physical manifestations of divine presence. When scribes tracked the moon's phases, they were tracking Nana. When they recorded Venus's heliacal rising, when it first became visible in the dawn sky after being hidden behind the sun, they were documenting Inanna's return from the underworld. When they calculated the sun's position against the backdrop of stars, they were measuring Utu's journey through the cosmos. This was observational astronomy and theology simultaneously. There was no distinction. To observe the sky was to witness the activities of the gods. To record celestial movements was to document divine decision-making. To predict eclipses or planetary conjunctions was to anticipate moments when the Anunnaki would gather in council, when fates would be decreed, when the cosmic order might shift. And so the question became, how do you preserve this knowledge? How do you ensure that future generations will know when to watch the sky, what patterns to look for, which celestial events signal divine activity? How do you encode, in permanent form, the decisions of beings who operate on cosmic timescales? The Mesopotamians had several answers. One was textual, vast collections of celestial omens, star catalogues, mathematical astronomy. We'll examine those shortly. But another answer was visual, symbolic, geometric. You create circular forms. You divide them into sections that mirror the divisions of heaven. You inscribe them with the authority of those who claim direct knowledge from the gods. You create a disc that shows a priestess performing ritual under divine sanction. You create a tablet that maps the night sky in 8 sectors. You create a circular world diagram that places your city at the centre of cosmic geography. You stamp your authority with cylinder seals that show earthly rulers beneath celestial symbols. But before any of those artefacts could be made, before the first circle was drawn, there had to be individuals who claimed the authority to do so. People who said, "The Anunnaki have granted me knowledge. I have been taught the secrets of heaven and earth. I stand between the divine assembly and human civilization. My words, my observations, my records are valid because they come from above." In Sumerian theology, there was a term for such people, En, often translated as Lord or High Priest, but the word carried deeper meaning. En designated someone who held direct connection to divine authority, who could enter the innermost shrine, who could speak to the gods and convey their decisions to humanity. The En wasn't simply a religious official, they were a cosmic intermediary. And in 2300 BC, one En made a choice that nobody before her had made. She commissioned an alabaster disc bearing her name, her title, and an image of her performing the rituals that maintain cosmic order. She wanted it known, wanted it recorded permanently, that she stood in that liminal space between the Anunnaki's decrees and human understanding. Her name was Enheduanna, the world's first author whose name and words survive. High Priestess of Nana at astronomer, poet, theologian, politician, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, placed in her position not just for religious reasons, but to consolidate his empire's control over southern Mesopotamia by linking military might with sacred authority. And she watched the stars. She tracked Venus through its complex 8-year cycle, its appearances as morning and evening star. She composed hymns that encoded astronomical data in poetic form. She claimed direct communication with Inanna, the goddess of Venus, and she commissioned a circle of stone to prove it. That circle still exists. That disc, excavated in 1927 from the Gipar, the residence of the High Priestess at now sits in Philadelphia, a tangible link between the Anunnaki's cosmic authority and the human need to preserve knowledge in forms that will outlast empires. We need to look at it closely, because what Enheduanna created wasn't just a monument to herself. It was the first known attempt to encode in circular form the relationship between heaven's decrees and human observation. It was the prototype for everything that came after. When kingship descended from heaven, someone had to be there to receive it. When the Anunnaki decreed fates, someone had to record the decrees. When celestial cycles marked divine activity, someone had to watch, to note, to preserve. Enheduanna claimed to be that someone, and the disc she left behind is where the pattern begins. The priestess who spoke to stars. The disc is smaller than you'd expect, 10 inches in diameter, less than an inch thick at its widest point. Alabaster, which when freshly carved would have been almost translucent, milky white, catching light in a way that clay never could. Now it's yellowed with age, display case lighting, bringing out the cream and ivory tones in the stone. Catalogue number B16665 in the Penn Museum, excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley's expedition during the 1926-1927 season at Ur, recovered from the Gippar, the sacred residence complex where the priestesses of Nana lived, worked, prayed and observed. The disc's face shows 4 figures in profile moving from left to right toward a stepped altar. The altar is clearly a temple facade, its tiers representing the ziggurat's structure. Before the altar stands a nude male figure, arms raised, pouring a libation. Behind him, 3 robed figures in procession. The figure at the back is partially damaged, but the middle 2 are clear. They wear the flounced robes characteristic of high-status individuals, and both appear to be performing ritual gestures. The second figure from the back, second from the right if you're looking at the disc, wears a specific type of headdress. It's tall, rounded at the top, with what appears to be a decorative band. This is the N crown, the distinctive marker of the High Priestess. And above this figure, in 4 clear cuneiform signs, the inscription reads, Enheduana Ziru Dinana. Enheduana, Ziru of Nana. Ziru is an Akkadian word. The disc uses Akkadian rather than Sumerian for this title, which tells us something about when it was made, during the Akkadian Empire's height, when Akkadian was becoming the administrative language even in Sumerian-speaking regions. Ziru is sometimes translated as High Priestess, but the word has nuances. It carries connotations of exalted one, she who is elevated, one who reaches toward heaven. This disc is not a funerary object. It was found in the Gippar complex, likely displayed in a niche or set into a wall where it would have been visible to those entering the priestess's residential area. It's a statement of authority, a claim that the rituals shown, the libation, the offering, the procession, are being performed by someone who has the cosmic right to perform them, someone whose connection to the divine is validated by this permanent record. But Enheduanna's authority didn't come only from this disc. We have her words. 42 temple hymns survive, attributed to her by ancient sources and confirmed by modern textual analysis. 3 longer hymns dedicated specifically to Inanna, Ininshagura, the great-hearted mistress, Ninmasara, the exaltation of Inanna, and Inimahusa, gods of the fearsome powers. These aren't simple songs of praise. They're complex theological works that map relationships between different deities, between different cities, between cosmic events and earthly politics, and they contain astronomy. Look at Ninmasara, the exaltation of Inanna. The hymn describes Inanna's power over heaven and earth, her ability to change fates, her role in war and love. But embedded in the poetic language are precise descriptions of Venus's behaviour. Inanna goes forth into heaven and returns to the underworld. She illuminates the evening and announces the morning. She disappears from the sky for periods, then reappears transformed. This is Venus's synodic cycle. Venus is never visible all night because its orbit is closer to the sun than Earth's. It appears as an evening star, setting shortly after sunset for about 263 days. Then it disappears for about 8 days as it passes between Earth and the sun. Then it reappears as a morning star, rising before dawn, for another 263 days. Then it disappears again for about 50 days as it passes behind the sun from our perspective. Then the cycle repeats. The Mesopotamians tracked this cycle obsessively. They knew that Venus's movements followed an 8-year pattern. After 8 years, its positions, relative to the stars, repeat almost exactly. They use this to create Venus calendars, and Enheduanna's hymns encode this knowledge in theological language. Inanna's descent to the underworld isn't just myth, it's astronomy. Her transformation, her return, her fury upon re-emerging, these are poetic descriptions of Venus's observable behaviour. Did Enheduanna watch Venus herself? Almost certainly. The Gippar at Ur would have had viewing platforms. Temple roofs throughout Mesopotamia served as observatories. The high priestess of the moon god would have been expected to track lunar phases, to predict new moons, to ensure that festivals aligned with celestial events. And the moon's cycles are intrinsically connected to Venus's. Both bodies appear in the night sky, both move against the backdrop of stars, both were associated with deities in the highest tier of the divine assembly. But there's something else in Enheduanna's disk that connects directly to our theme. Look again at its shape. A circle, not a rectangular tablet like most administrative documents, not a cylinder seal that would be rolled, not a statue in the round, a flat circular disc meant to be viewed face on. Why? In Mesopotamian cosmology, circular forms represented completeness, totality, the eternal. The sun's disk was circular, the full moon was circular, the horizon, the boundary between earth and sky, appeared circular to someone standing on flat terrain, looking in all directions. When temple architects designed their structures, they often incorporated circular elements, circular offering tables, circular foundation deposits, circular altars. The circle had no beginning or end. It represented cyclical time rather than linear time. And for a culture that tracked celestial cycles, that organised its calendar around the recurring patterns of sun, moon and stars, that believed the gods decreed fates in repeating assemblies, the circle was the geometric form that best expressed cosmic truth. Enheduanna's disk is circular because her authority was cyclical. Year after year she performed the same rituals. Month after month she observed the same celestial patterns. The disk doesn't show a unique historical event. It shows what she did regularly, repeatedly, eternally. The circle embodies that eternality. And there's evidence that Enheduanna wasn't the first to use circular forms to encode religious authority, just the first whose name survived on one. Archaeologists have recovered dozens of circular stone discs from early dynastic period sites across Mesopotamia, pre-Akkadian, predating Enheduanna by several centuries. These discs often show ritual scenes, libations, offerings, processions, but most are anonymous. They record the action without recording who performed it. Enheduanna innovated by adding her name. She made the connection explicit. This circle represents eternal ritual, and I am the one authorized to perform it. My authority comes from Nana, from the Anunnaki who decreed that priesthood should exist, who established the me that governed temple service. This disc proves my connection to that cosmic order. But did she actually believe the Anunnaki existed as she described them in her hymns? Or was this theological poetry, a metaphorical system for expressing natural observation? We can't know her private thoughts. We can only know what she recorded. And what she recorded over and over was that knowledge came from the divine realm, that celestial observation was religious duty, that the patterns in the sky reflected the decisions of conscious beings who governed cosmos and earth alike. Her most famous hymn, Ninmasara, includes a passage that's worth quoting in full. The translation is from Betty de Chong-Maydor's work, Inanna, Lady of Largest Heart. You, when you, Inanna, opened the gate to heaven, you opened it, you took your place, you covered the city with radiance, you made the ground shake with fury, you stood in the bright light of heaven, you called out the judgment. This isn't just poetry, it's a description of Venus rising, of its apparent brightness. Venus is the brightest celestial object after the sun and moon, of the way ancient peoples understood that brightness as divine presence. And the final line, you called out the judgment. This connects Venus's appearance to the Anunnaki's function of decreeing fates. When Venus rose, Inanna was present in the council. When Venus disappeared, Inanna had descended to the underworld, absent from the assembly. If you were a citizen of Ur in 2300 BCE, you would have understood this implicitly. You would have looked at the evening sky, seen Venus blazing above the western horizon, and known Inanna is in heaven. The council is in session. Fates are being decreed. The cosmic order is being renewed. And you would have known that Enheduanna, the high priestess, was watching too, recording, composing hymns that would be copied and recopied for the next 2,000 years, that would be found on tablets as far away as Nineveh, that would influence Babylonian astronomy and Assyrian astrology, and eventually, through complex chains of transmission, Greek and Roman and Islamic celestial science. The disc at Penn Museum is her proof. It says, "I was there. I maintained the connection. I watched the stars and spoke their language to humans. The circle preserves that claim for as long as stone endures." But Enheduanna was one priestess in one city in one century. What happened to this tradition after Ur fell, after the Akkadian Empire collapsed, after dynasties rose and fell and the political map of Mesopotamia was redrawn a dozen times? The knowledge didn't disappear. It was copied, compiled, systematized. Over the next 1500 years, scribes in dozens of cities recorded celestial observations, organized them into vast catalogues, created mathematical models to predict astronomical events, and eventually one king decided that all of this knowledge needed to be gathered in a single place, preserved for posterity, protected from the wars and collapses that had destroyed so many libraries before. That king was Ashurbanipal. His library was in Nineveh, and when it burned in 612 BC, the fire that destroyed the city preserved the tablets by baking them hard, turning fragile clay into something approaching stone. Among those tablets, a circular star map, 5 inches across, dividing the night sky into 8 sections. Catalogue number K 8538. Proof that what Enheduanna began, the preservation of celestial knowledge in circular form, had become standard practice across the Mesopotamian world. We need to go to Nineveh, to the library that shouldn't have survived, to the king who collected everything, to the moment when observation became archive, when living tradition became permanent record. The circle pattern continues, but first it becomes knowledge written down, the library that preserved the heavens. Ashurbanipal ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 669 to around 631 B, the last great king before the empire's collapse. He was educated, literate in both Akkadian and Sumerian, proud of his scribal training. In his own inscriptions, he boasted about his abilities. "I have learned the hidden treasure of all scribal knowledge. I have been initiated into divination from heaven and earth. In the assembly of scholars, I have debated from texts. I have discussed with expert diviners the series If the Liver is a Mirror of Heaven." This wasn't typical royal propaganda. Most Mesopotamian kings emphasized military prowess, territorial conquest, temple construction. Ashurbanipal emphasized knowledge. He didn't just collect tablets, he understood what they contained. He could read celestial omens himself, could verify what the scholars told him, could participate in the technical discussions about astronomical prediction, and he was obsessed with preservation. Perhaps because he sensed correctly that his empire was nearing its end. Perhaps because he understood that knowledge outlasts political power. Whatever his motivation, he issued a decree that changed history. Every tablet dealing with divination, astronomy, medicine, magic, literature, history, and ritual should be copied and brought to Nineveh. Scribes were dispatched across the empire with explicit instructions. If a tablet existed, Ashurbanipal wanted a copy. The result was the first intentionally created research library in human history. Not a temple archive focused on one institution's records, not a palace collection of royal propaganda, a comprehensive cross-disciplinary library organized by subject matter, catalogued, curated, maintained by specialized librarians who could locate texts on demand. When British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated Nineveh between 1849 and 1851, followed by Hormuzd Rassam's work from 1853 to 1854, they recovered approximately 30,000 clay tablets from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace. Most were broken, many fragmentary, scattered by the destruction of the city in 612 BC when a coalition of Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh and ended Assyrian dominance. But the fire that burned the palace baked the tablets. Clay tablets are fragile when unbaked or lightly fired. They can dissolve in water, crumble with handling, erode over centuries. But when exposed to intense heat, they become almost indestructible. The destruction of Ashurbanipal's library preserved it. Among the recovered tablets, vast sections of the Enuma Anu Enlil series, 70 tablets of celestial omens covering lunar, solar, meteorological, and planetary phenomena. Multiple copies of the Mul.Apin Compendium, the standard Babylonian astronomical reference work listing stars, constellations, rising and setting times, mathematical schemes for tracking celestial cycles, medical texts, magic texts, myths and epics, including the most complete version of the Gilgamesh story, ritual instructions, royal inscriptions, letters between scholars and the king discussing astronomical observations and their interpretations, and one circular tablet, fragmentary but recognizable, carefully restored from multiple pieces, K8538, the planisphere. It measures approximately 5 inches across, maybe a bit less. The edges are damaged, making precise measurement difficult. The surface is divided into 8 wedge-shaped sections radiating from a slightly off center point. Each section contains cuneiform notations, some clear, others eroded. The reverse side is uninscribed, or if it was inscribed, nothing remains legible. The tablet was published by R. Campbell Thompson in the early 20th century and catalogued as part of the Assyrian Astronomical Corpus. But its significance wasn't fully understood until the 1990s, when researchers at the British Museum began detailed analysis. They identified it as a celestial planisphere, a two-dimensional representation of the three-dimensional celestial sphere as viewed from a specific location at a specific time. The key breakthrough came when they realized the tablet wasn't showing the entire sky. It was showing the sky visible from Nineveh looking in one direction during a particular night. By comparing the constellation notations with computer models of ancient star positions adjusted for precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that shifts star positions over millennia, they calculated that K8538 records the night sky on January 3/4, 650 BCE, 19 years into Ashurbanipal's reign, a date when we know from other records that the king was particularly concerned with celestial omens, when multiple letters from court astronomers discuss unusual phenomena, when political instability in the empire made divination crucial for royal decision-making. Someone, likely a court astronomer attached to the king's household, went outside on that January night, observed the sky carefully, and recorded what they saw in 8 sectors. Why 8? The number 8 appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian astronomical texts. The calendar was based on lunar months, with each month divided into 4 quarters corresponding roughly to moon phases: new moon, first quarter, full moon, last quarter. 8 was significant as double the quaternary division. The horizon as seen from Mesopotamian cities could be divided into 8 primary directions: north, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, west, northwest. The night sky, rotating around the celestial pole, could be mentally divided into 8 sectors, radiating from that pole like slices of a pie. This 8-fold division appears in texts like the Astrolabe tablets, an earlier astronomical series that organised stars into 3 concentric paths, the paths of Enlil, Anu, and Ea, each containing multiple constellations. Stars were assigned to months, to watches of the night, to specific rising and setting times, and the system used octagonal geometry to organise this information visually. K8538 is applying that system to an actual observation. It's not a theoretical star catalogue, it's a record of the real sky on a specific night, organised according to a standardised template. What does this tell us about Mesopotamian astronomy by the 7th century BC? Several things. First, observational accuracy had reached a high level. The tablet's notations match actual star positions. The person who made this wasn't guessing or copying from old reference works. They were observing. Second, standardised recording methods existed. The 8-sector division, the notation system, the use of circular geometry, these weren't invented for K8538. They were conventional, part of a centuries-old tradition of astronomical record-keeping. Third, such observations were considered important enough to preserve permanently. This wasn't a scratch pad or working calculation discarded after use. It was baked, archived, kept in the Royal Library alongside the canonical Omen series and mythological epics. But here's where it connects back to the Anunnaki and the theological framework we discussed earlier. Look at the names of the constellations inscribed on K.8538. They aren't neutral astronomical designations, they're divine names. One section marks Mulmul, the Pleiades, called the star in Sumerian, associated with the 7 great gods of the Anunnaki Council. Another marks Mul.Apin, the plough, the constellation that gave its name to the Mul.Apin compendium, associated with Enlil as the god of agriculture and cosmic order. Others mark Mul.Shu.Yi, the old man, sometimes identified with Perseus. Mul.Gam, the crook, associated with Nergal. Mul.Ur.Gu.La, the lion, possibly Leo or part of Leo. These aren't just convenient labels. They reflect a cosmology in which celestial bodies are divine or divinely governed. When the astronomer recorded the Pleiades' position, they were noting where the Anunnaki's presence was visible in the sky. When they tracked rising and setting times, they were documenting the gods' movements. And this connects directly to the Omen series preserved alongside the planisphere. The Enuma Anu Enlil tablets organise celestial phenomena into predictive statements. If the moon is eclipsed in the evening watch and Venus is present, the king will die and his son will take the throne. If Mars approaches the Scorpion constellation, plague will affect the land. If Jupiter moves retrograde in Taurus, rebellion in the western provinces. These omens weren't superstition in the modern sense. They were based on centuries of observation. The Mesopotamians had noticed correlations. Certain celestial events preceded certain earthly events. Whether those correlations represented causation, divine communication, or simple pattern recognition is a separate question. The point is, they took them seriously. Kings made policy decisions based on astronomical omens. Generals timed military campaigns to avoid inauspicious configurations. Priests adjusted ritual calendars when celestial events didn't match predictions. Ashurbanipal needed this knowledge. He needed to know when the gods, the Anunnaki whose decrees governed earthly fates, were making decisions that would affect his reign. And the gods' decisions were visible in the sky. So the sky had to be watched, recorded, preserved. The circular planisphere K.8538 is one piece of that vast project. It's a snapshot, a single night's observation, probably made during a period when something significant was expected or observed. Perhaps a conjunction, perhaps an eclipse, perhaps simply a routine recording session. We don't have enough context to know exactly why January 3rd, 650 BC mattered, but we know it mattered enough to become permanent, to be inscribed, archived, preserved alongside the great literary and divinatory texts of Mesopotamian civilization. And we know that the person who made it chose a circular form, not a rectangular tablet like most library texts. A circle divided into 8 sections like the 8-pointed star that symbolized Inanna Ishtar in Near Assyrian iconography. A circle that represented the dome of heaven as visible from Nineveh, as complete as any two-dimensional representation could be. This is the second circle in our pattern. The first, Enheduanna's disk, showed human authority sanctioned by divine connection. This one, K.8538, shows divine presence recorded through human observation. Both use circular geometry to encode cosmic truth as understood by Mesopotamian culture. But there was a third kind of circle, a third way the Mesopotamians tried to capture the totality of cosmic order, not a personal authority disk, not a specific night star map, a representation of the entire world as they understood it, with all its physical and mythological geography, its structure and meaning, its place in divine creation. That circle sits in the same museum as the planisphere, just a few galleries away, a fragment of clay showing the world as a disk, floating in the cosmic ocean, with Babylon at its centre and strange regions extending beyond the known lands. We need to look at it carefully, because when Dr. Irving Finkel finally deciphered its accompanying text in 2024, he found something unexpected. A connection to the oldest flood story in Mesopotamian literature, a map that encoded theology in geographical form, a circle that claimed to show where the gods had walked, where the ark had landed, where knowledge had first come down from heaven to earth. The pattern continues, and with each circle, the question becomes sharper. Were these people preserving observation, or were they documenting something else entirely, the world as they drew it? The tablet designated BM 92687 in the British Museum's collection is smaller than your palm, 8 by 7 centimetres, barely larger than a credit card. Fragmentary, pieces are missing from the upper right, and the surface is worn in places where the cuneiform has eroded. It was acquired by the museum in 1882, part of a larger collection purchased from a dealer who claimed the tablets came from Sippar, the ancient city north of Babylon, famous for its sun god temple and extensive scribal schools. The date is uncertain. The script and language indicate late Babylonian period, somewhere between 700 and 500 BC, contemporary with the Neo-Babylonian dynasty that succeeded the Assyrians. Some scholars lean toward the 6th century, making it roughly a century younger than Ashurbanipal's planisphere, but from a different cultural tradition, Babylonian rather than Assyrian, though both drew on the same ancient Sumerian foundations. What makes BM 92687 unique among Mesopotamian tablets is immediately obvious when you look at it. There's a circle drawn on the surface, and inside that circle, a diagram. This is the Imago Mundi, the image of the world, the oldest surviving map that attempts to show the entire known Earth. Not in accurate geographical detail, this isn't cartography in the modern sense, it's cosmography, a schematic representation of how the Babylonians understood the structure of the world at both physical and theological levels. The circle itself represents water, labelled Maratu, the bitter river or bitter sea, the cosmic ocean that was believed to encircle all land. Inside this circle, near the centre, a rectangle marked with cuneiform, Beli, Babylon. This is the axis mundi, the centre of the world from the Babylonian perspective, the city of Marduk, the political capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Running through Babylon, two parallel lines representing the Euphrates River. The river comes from the north, flows through Babylon, continues southward to the sea. This matches reality. Babylon sat on the Euphrates, depended on it for irrigation, transport, life itself. Around Babylon, 7 other regions are marked. The labels are partly damaged, but scholars have identified most of them: Assyria to the north, Urartu to the northeast, Suzerem to the east, and others representing territories that the Babylonians traded with, warred against, or knew through long cultural contact. But what's fascinating, what transforms this from simple geography to cosmology, is what lies beyond the bitter river. 8 triangular regions extend outward from the circle like points on a compass rose. These are called nag in the text, usually translated as distant regions or outer lands, and they aren't real places that you could travel to with enough time and supplies. They're mythological territories, realms described in ancient epics, places where the boundaries between earthly and divine were thin. Above the map, pressed into the clay in narrow columns, a text in Akkadian cuneiform. It's damaged, large sections are illegible, but what remains describes these outer regions and what exists in them. For over a century, scholars could only partially read this text, but in August 2024, Dr. Irving Finkel, assistant keeper in the Department of the Middle East at the British Museum, published a new analysis that solved several previously unclear passages. Finkel is a specialist in cuneiform, known for his work on everything from ancient board games to exorcism rituals. He's spent decades studying BM 92687, comparing it to other geographical and mythological texts, trying to understand what the Babylonians intended with this diagram. And he found something remarkable in one of the passages describing a northern nag. The text mentions a great ship, gives its dimensions, describes a journey across the Bitter River to reach this distant land. The ship's measurements in Babylonian cubits, converted to meters, match almost exactly the dimensions of the ark described in the Babylonian flood story, the version preserved in the Atrahasis epic and in Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In those flood narratives, the hero Napishti in Gilgamesh, Atrahasis in the earlier version, is warned by the god Ea Enki that the Anunnaki have decided to destroy humanity with a deluge. He tells him to build a great cube-shaped boat, 120 cubits on each side, seal it with bitumen, load it with animals and craftsmen, and prepare for the flood. The boat floats for 7 days while the world drowns. Then it lands on a mountain, and Utanapishti performs sacrifice, and the gods, regretting their decision, gather like flies around the offering. This is, of course, the template for the biblical Noah story, which was clearly influenced by, or derived from, Mesopotamian sources after Israelite contact with Babylonian culture, especially during the exile in the 6th century BCE. But here's what Finkel realised. The Babylonian world map isn't just showing current geography, it's mapping mythological geography. One of the outer Nag regions is where the ark landed. The map is saying, if you could cross the Bitter River, if you could leave the known world and enter the mythological realm, you would reach the place where the flood hero survived, where the gods came down to smell the sacrifice, where a direct encounter between human and divine occurred. The map encodes narrative. It places myth and reality on the same diagram, suggesting they're part of the same continuum. The world you can visit, Babylon, Assyria, Elam, sits inside the circle. The world you can only reach in story, the mountain of the Ark, the cedar forest of Gilgamesh's quest, the land where the sun rises, sits beyond the circle but is still mappable, still part of a coherent geographical system. Why does this matter for understanding the Anunnaki's role in Mesopotamian thought? Because the flood story is fundamentally about the Anunnaki's decision-making process. In every version of the tale, it's the council of the great gods who decide to send the flood. Enlil, as executive authority, proposes the destruction. The other gods agree. Only Ea Enki dissents. But even he can't overrule the council's decree. He can only subvert it by warning a single human. The flood represents the ultimate expression of divine power over earthly fate. It's the Anunnaki exercising their cosmic authority, reshaping the world according to their will. And when Utanapishti survives, when the boat lands on the mountain, he becomes a bridge figure, a human who has witnessed divine decision-making, who carries knowledge from the pre-flood world into the post-flood world, who can testify that the Anunnaki exist and act. The Babylonian map places this event in geographical space. It says there is a real location, mythologically real, if not physically reachable, where this happened. The knowledge that humanity possesses, the traditions we've inherited, the understanding of how the gods operate, all of it can be traced back to that place beyond the Bitter River, where divine and human met in the aftermath of cosmic destruction. And the map draws this as a circle, not an irregular shape following coastlines and borders. A perfect circle, or as perfect as hand drawing on clay can achieve, with Babylon at the centre and the mythological regions radiating outward in symmetric eightfold arrangement. 8 regions, the same number of sectors as the planisphere K8538, the same numerical pattern that appears in astronomical texts, in ritual descriptions, in temple architecture. 8 as the number of cosmic completeness, the doubling of the 4 cardinal directions, the structure that organizes both spatial and temporal cycles. The circle with 8 divisions wasn't unique to the world map. It was a template that Mesopotamian scholars applied across multiple domains. Heaven was 8 sectors, the known world was 8 directions. Time cycled in multiples of 8, 8 watches of the night, 8-day weeks in some calendars, 8-year Venus cycles. This suggests that when educated Babylonians looked at BM 92687, they weren't just seeing a map, they were seeing a cosmological statement, as above, so below. The structure of heaven is reflected in the structure of earth. The cycles of celestial bodies mirror the cycles of human history. The decisions of the Anunnaki Council, which meets in the 8th heaven according to some texts, ripple outward to affect even the most distant mythological regions. But there's something else we need to consider. The map was made in the 6th century BC, during or shortly after the Neo-Babylonian Empire's height. This was the era of Nebuchadnezzar II, who rebuilt Babylon into the most magnificent city of the ancient world, the Ishtar Gate, the Hanging Gardens, the great ziggurat Etemenanke of heaven and earth that may have inspired the Tower of Babel story. This was also a period of intense scholarly activity. The astronomical diaries, daily records of celestial observations, began in this era. Mathematical astronomy reached new levels of sophistication. The zodiac, as a 12-fold division of the ecliptic, was formalized. Babylonian scholars were creating systematic, comprehensive accounts of their knowledge, organizing everything they'd inherited from 2 millennia of Sumerian and Akkadian tradition. The world map fits into this project. It's an attempt to visualize the totality of geographical knowledge, to create a reference diagram that students could memorize, that scholars could refer to, that would encode the relationship between known and mythological geography in a single, glanceable form. And they chose a circle because circles represented totality. The world was complete within the Bitter River. Everything outside was beyond, interesting, important in myth and theology, but not part of the ordinary human realm. The circle was a boundary as much as a shape, yet the boundary was permeable in story. Heroes crossed it. Gilgamesh journeyed to the edge of the world, seeking immortality. Utanapishti crossed it in his ark. The sun god travelled through it daily, rising from the eastern waters and setting into the western waters. The boundary marked difference, not absolute separation. This becomes important when we turn to the 4th and most controversial circle in our pattern, a cylinder seal that some claim shows the solar system, complete with a mysterious extra planet, while others dismiss it as conventional religious iconography. The truth, as always, is more complex than either extreme allows, because what seal VA243 definitely shows is a hierarchical arrangement, a cosmic order, an above and below structure where earthly authority is validated by celestial symbols. And that's the consistent pattern across all 4 circles we're examining. Authority flows from the cosmic to the earthly. Knowledge originates in the divine realm and is transmitted to humans. The Anunnaki decree, humans record. The gods observe the heavens from their celestial assembly. Priests observe the same heavens from temple roofs, tracking the physical manifestations of divine presence. But before we look at VA243 and its contentious interpretation, we need to understand what Mesopotamians actually knew about the sky. Not what modern interpreters claim they knew, what their texts document, what astronomical literacy actually existed in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. Because if we're going to evaluate whether a cylinder seal shows the solar system, we need to know, did they understand planetary motion? Did they conceive of the sun as the centre of anything? Did they have any framework for depicting astronomical knowledge in visual form? The answer is yes, but not in the way most people assume. Mesopotamian astronomy was sophisticated, accurate, mathematical, but it was also embedded in a worldview where every celestial body was divine, where observation and theology couldn't be separated. So let's look at what they knew, what they recorded, what they preserved in circular forms, and why those forms mattered. Because the pattern we're tracing, the pattern of the 4 circles, isn't complete yet, and the most controversial piece is still waiting, the seal that sparked controversy. Cylinder seal VA243 sits in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, though it's not currently on public display. It measures approximately 4 centimetres tall and 2 centimetres in diameter, carved from greenstone, probably chlorite or serpentine, during the Akkadian period, roughly 2300-2200 BCE. This makes it contemporary with Enhedu Anna's disk, both created during the era when the Akkadian Empire unified Mesopotamia under Sargon and his successors. When you roll a cylinder seal across soft clay, it creates a continuous frieze, a repeating image that can be extended as long as needed. Cylinder seals were personal signatures, ownership marks, administrative stamps. They depicted the owner's identity, status, and often their religious affiliation. The imagery was standardized. You could look at dozens of Akkadian period seals and see similar scenes: a worshipper before a deity, animals in heraldic poses, symbolic objects representing divine authority. VA243 follows this pattern. The main scene shows a seated figure on a throne or elevated platform. This figure wears a horned crown, the distinctive marker of divinity in Mesopotamian iconography. Before this seated deity stands a smaller figure, shown in profile, wearing a long robe. The standing figure's hands are raised in a gesture of worship or supplication. Between them, a vertical object that could be a staff, a plant, or a stylized tree, common Mesopotamian symbolic elements representing life, authority, or cosmic connection. To the right of the scene, partially separated by a vertical line that might indicate a division between registers or simply be a decorative element, additional figures appear. The details are somewhat eroded, but it seems to be a procession or group of attendants. All of this is utterly conventional for an Akkadian period seal. The iconography would have been immediately recognizable to anyone in 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, a worshipper seeking favor from a deity, with the seal owner's identity likely conveyed through details of dress, posture, or accompanying symbols. But in the upper left portion of the seal, above the seated deity's head, there's a cluster of circular marks, one larger circle with a cross or asterisk pattern inside it, surrounded by 11 smaller dots arranged in a roughly circular pattern around the larger symbol. In every other Akkadian seal showing similar star and dot patterns, scholars interpret these as standard celestial symbols, stars representing divinity, dots representing additional divine beings or celestial bodies, the cluster as a whole indicating the heavens or the divine realm. Nothing unusual, nothing requiring special explanation. Then, in 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first book in his Earth Chronicles series. Sitchin was not an Assyriologist or archaeologist. He had an economics degree from the University of London and worked as a journalist. But he had taught himself to read Hebrew and studied ancient texts as an amateur. His thesis, developed across multiple books, was that the Sumerian and Akkadian texts describing the Anunnaki were not mythology, but historical records of extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth from a hypothetical planet called Nibiru. According to Sitchin's interpretation, VA243's star and dot cluster depicted the solar system, the central star was the Sun, and the 11 dots were Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, 9 known planets, plus the Moon outed as a separate body, and Nibiru. Itself, a large planet on a long elliptical orbit that supposedly passes through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. This interpretation requires several assumptions. That 3rd millennium BC Mesopotamians knew about Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, planets not visible to the naked eye, not discovered by modern astronomy until 1781, 1846 and 1930 respectively, that they conceived of the Sun as the centre of planetary orbits rather than as one light giving body among others, that they chose to depict this astronomical knowledge on a personal cylinder seal rather than in any of the thousands of astronomical texts that survive, that the seal carver depicted the Sun with a cross or asterisk pattern, even though Mesopotamian iconography consistently showed the sun god Shamash with a specific symbol, a winged disc or a 4-pointed star with wavy rays between the points, that this single seal preserves knowledge not found anywhere else in the entire cuneiform corpus. Sitchin's book became a bestseller. It spawned an entire alternative archaeology movement focused on ancient astronaut theories, and VA243 became famous, not among scholars who dismissed Sitchin's interpretation immediately, but among the general public. Images of the seal circulated online, often with explanatory graphics showing the planets labelled, sometimes with comparison images of the modern solar system. The scholarly response was swift and detailed. Dr. Michael Heiser, an expert in ancient Semitic languages and biblical studies, published a comprehensive debunking showing that the sun symbol doesn't match any known Mesopotamian solar iconography. The dots aren't arranged like planets in orbital rings, they're scattered irregularly. Akkadian seals routinely show star and dot clusters representing the heavens or the host of heaven, a generic indication of the divine realm. No cuneiform text from any period describes a 12-body solar system. The Mesopotamians did have names for 5 visible planets, Rikri, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, plus Sun and Moon, but they didn't group them as we do. Each was a deity moving through the sky according to divine will, not following mechanical orbital laws. Dr. Wayne Horowitz, author of Mesopotamian Cosmic Geography, pointed out that Mesopotamian cosmology envisioned a flat Earth covered by a solid dome of heaven, with celestial bodies moving across the inner surface of that dome. There was no concept of orbits, no heliocentric model, no framework for understanding planets as worlds like Earth. Other scholars noted that if the Mesopotamians had such advanced astronomical knowledge, they would have recorded it in their astronomical texts. The Molder Epin tablets, the Enuma Anu Enlil series, the astronomical diaries, these contain incredibly detailed observations of planetary positions, eclipse predictions, stellar risings and settings, but nowhere do they describe anything like Sitchin's interpretation. So the scholarly consensus is clear. VA243 does not depict the solar system. It shows conventional religious iconography, a worshipper, a deity, and celestial symbols indicating the divine nature of the scene. But consensus doesn't mean the seal is uninteresting or irrelevant to our inquiry. In fact, VA243 is crucial, not for what Sitchin claimed it showed, but for what it actually demonstrates about Mesopotamian thinking. Look at the seal's composition again. The earthly scene, worshipper and deity, occupies the lower 2/3. The celestial symbols occupy the upper third. This spatial arrangement is significant. Heaven is literally above earth. The divine realm is spatially superior, and the two realms are connected within a single frame, a single continuous image that wraps around the cylinder. This is cosmology in miniature. When an Akkadian official pressed this seal into clay to authorize a document, they were asserting that their authority had cosmic sanction. The transaction being recorded, whether a land sale, a loan agreement, a tax receipt, was conducted in a world where divine and earthly hierarchies paralleled each other, the god above, the worshipper below, the stars witnessing, and the seal uses circular geometry to express this. The cylinder itself is circular in cross-section. When rolled, it creates a repeating band, a circular frieze. The cluster of celestial symbols is arranged roughly in a circle around the central star. The form embodies the concept cosmic order is circular, complete, self-contained, eternal. This connects back to what we've seen in the other three circles. Enheduanna's disk showed human authority sanctioned by divine connection. Her circular disk proved she stood between heaven and earth. The planisphere K8538 showed the celestial realm mapped in circular form, the night sky as an 8-sectored disk. The Babylonian world map showed terrestrial and mythological geography as a circle floating in the cosmic ocean. VA243 shows the same structure compressed into a portable, reproducible form. It's a circular seal creating circular impressions, depicting the relationship between earthly and cosmic in standardized iconography that anyone in Akkadian culture could read instantly. The controversy around VA243 reveals something important about how we approach ancient evidence. When we want the Mesopotamians to have had secret knowledge, whether about astronomy, technology, or anything else, we often project our own frameworks backward. We assume they must have understood things as we do, just with different terminology. We interpret ambiguous imagery through modern categories. But the Mesopotamians weren't proto-scientists waiting for modern astronomy to vindicate their insights. They were sophisticated observers working within a completely different cosmological framework. They didn't need to know about Uranus and Neptune to have valid astronomical knowledge. Their knowledge was real, practical, and effective within their worldview. So what did they actually know about celestial bodies? What astronomical literacy existed in Mesopotamia from the 3rd millennium through the 1st millennium BC? What could they observe, calculate, and predict? The answer is far more than most people realise, but in categories that don't map neatly onto modern astronomy. By the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1600 BC, scribes had identified the 5 visible planets and given them names that would persist for millennia. They called them Bibu, wild sheep or wandering stars, because unlike the fixed stars that maintained their positions relative to each other, these 5 objects moved through the zodiacal constellations following complex paths. Jupiter was Mulu Baba, white star, associated with the god Marduk. Saturn was Kaimanu Steady One, associated with Ninurta. Mars was Salbatanu, warrior star, associated with Nergal, god of war and plague. Venus was Dilbat, associated with Inanna Ishtar. This we've already discussed in relation to Enheduanna. Mercury was Guutu, associated with Nabu, god of writing and wisdom. Each planet had its own cycle, its own pattern of appearances and disappearances, its own periods of direct and retrograde motion when a planet appears to reverse direction against the background stars due to the relative orbital positions of Earth and the outer planet. And Mesopotamian astronomers tracked these patterns with increasing precision across the centuries. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to the Old Babylonian period, records Venus's heliacal risings and settings over a 21-year period during the reign of King Amisaduqa, 1446-1626 BC. The tablet notes the exact day when Venus first became visible in the morning sky, how many months it remained visible, when it disappeared, how long it was invisible, when it reappeared as an evening star. These observations were accurate enough that modern astronomers have used them to help establish absolute chronology in Mesopotamian history. The Mol.Apin tablets, compiled around 1000 BC but incorporating earlier material, list about 70 constellations and stars visible from Mesopotamia. The tablets describe when each star group rises and sets throughout the year, creating a stellar calendar that could be used to track agricultural seasons, predict weather patterns, and time religious festivals. The tablets also contain mathematical schemes for intercalation, adding extra months to the lunar calendar to keep it synchronized with the solar year. The Enuma Anu Enlil series, which we've mentioned before, represents the culmination of early Mesopotamian celestial divination. 70 tablets organised by category, lunar phenomena in tablets 122, solar phenomena in tablets 2329, meteorological phenomena in tablets 3049, and planetary phenomena in tablets 5070. These tablets don't just record observations, they pair observations with predicted outcomes. If the moon is eclipsed in the evening watch and Venus stands in the east, the king will die, his son will not take the throne, a usurper will seize power. This isn't primitive superstition, it's pattern recognition based on centuries of record keeping. The Mesopotamians had noticed that certain celestial configurations preceded certain political events. Whether this represented actual causation, self-fulfilling prophecy, or coincidence is debatable, but the observations themselves were real. By the Neo-Babylonian period, the 6th century BC, the era of our world map, and shortly before the fall of Babylon to Persia, Mesopotamian astronomy had become mathematical. Scribes developed what we now call Babylonian astronomy, using arithmetic progressions and zigzag functions to predict planetary positions without requiring continuous observation. They calculated lunar eclipses years in advance. They tracked the slow wobble in the moon's orbital nodes. They developed period relations, how many years pass before a planet returns to the same position against the background stars. And crucially, they understood that these celestial cycles were connected. The Saros cycle, the 18-year period after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat in a similar pattern, was known to Babylonian astronomers by at least the 4th century BCE. They knew that 19 solar years equal 235 lunar months, which allowed them to create accurate lunisolar calendars. They calculated that Venus returns to the same position after 8 years, Jupiter after 12 years, Saturn after 30 years. These numbers were sacred because they reflected divine order. The gods had created a cosmos that operated according to mathematical principles. To discover those principles, to calculate future positions of celestial bodies, was to glimpse the mind of the Anunnaki who had established cosmic law. But, and this is crucial, none of this required understanding heliocentrism or knowing about distant planets. The Mesopotamians observed from Earth, recorded what they saw from Earth, and developed a geocentric mathematical astronomy that was remarkably accurate for their purposes. They knew the 5 visible planets move through the zodiac at different rates. They knew the sun, moon and planets all moved along the same band of sky. They knew Venus's cycle was tied to the sun's annual motion. But they didn't conceptualize orbits in the modern sense. They tracked divine beings moving through heaven according to patterns established by the Cosmic Council. This is what makes VA 243's modern interpretation so problematic. Even if we wanted to argue that the seal depicts astronomical knowledge, it doesn't match what we know Mesopotamian astronomy actually looked like. They didn't arrange celestial bodies around the sun. They didn't think in terms of solar systems. They observed risings, settings, conjunctions, oppositions, angular relationships as seen from Earth. What they did think, in terms of what permeates their astronomical texts, is hierarchy and order. The celestial realm was organised just as human society was organised. Rulers, administrators, lesser officials, commoners. The great gods, the 7 who decree fates, corresponded to the most important celestial bodies, sun, moon, and 5 visible planets. Below them, a host of lesser gods corresponded to fixed stars. All of these moved through heaven according to the decrees issued in the divine assembly. And humans had access to this knowledge because certain individuals, priests, priestesses, scribes, diviners, claimed direct connection to divine teaching. They weren't discovering astronomy through pure observation. They were preserving knowledge that had been revealed by the Anunnaki to earlier generations. This is explicit in texts like the Era epic, where the god Ea Enka is described as the one who set the celestial bodies in their places, who established the patterns of heaven and earth, or the Enuma Elish, where Marduk creates the calendar by establishing the paths of sun, moon and stars, or the countless ritual texts that describe offerings made to the gods who established the cosmic order. The Mesopotamians didn't see themselves as scientists uncovering natural law. They saw themselves as inheritors of a tradition established at the beginning of time, when the Anunnaki had organized chaos into cosmos, when divine beings had taught the first humans how to observe, calculate, and predict. This brings us to a question that runs through all 4 circles we've examined. If the Mesopotamians believed their knowledge came from divine sources, why did they preserve it in circular forms? What was the connection between the shape and the content? Part of the answer is practical. Circular forms are geometrically special. A circle has constant radius, uniform curvature, no beginning or end. It's the most efficient way to enclose area, maximum space with minimum perimeter. It naturally represents things like horizons, celestial domes, enclosed worlds. But there's a deeper, more theological answer. In Mesopotamian thought, circles represented completion and return. The sun's disk was circular, and the sun returned to the same position each year. The moon's full disk was circular, and the moon's phases cycled endlessly. The zodiac was a circular band, and planets returned to the same constellations in predictable periods. Time itself was circular in Mesopotamian understanding, not in the sense that identical events repeat. They didn't believe in strict cyclical time, but in the sense that patterns recur, seasons return, cosmic order reasserts itself despite temporary chaos. The Anunnaki's decrees weren't one-time pronouncements, they were eternal principles that governed ongoing cycles. To preserve knowledge in circular form was to assert that the knowledge participated in this eternal order. Enheduanna's disk would be valid not just for her lifetime, but forever, because the relationship between priestess and god was part of an eternal pattern. The planisphere K8538 recorded one night sky, but that sky was part of an eternal celestial order. The world map showed one era's geography, but the structure it depicted, centre, periphery, cosmic ocean, was timeless. Even VA243, whatever its specific iconography meant, encoded an eternal truth. Earthly authority flows from cosmic authority, and both are witnessed by the heavenly host. This is why these 4 circles, separated by centuries, created for different purposes, preserved in different museums, form a coherent pattern. They're all attempting the same thing, to encode cosmic knowledge in a form that will endure, using geometry that symbolises the eternal nature of what's being preserved. But we haven't yet addressed how that knowledge was transmitted. If the Anunnaki supposedly established cosmic order at the beginning of time, how did humans gain access to that knowledge? The texts give us specific mechanisms, specific stories about divine-human interaction, and those stories often involve teaching, gods descending to instruct mortals in arts and sciences. This is where the theological framework connecting all 4 circles becomes most explicit. Because Mesopotamian tradition didn't just say the gods existed, it said the gods actively taught humanity, that civilization itself was a gift from the divine realm, that every craft and science traced back to a moment of revelation. We need to examine those teaching stories, because they explain why astronomical knowledge was considered sacred, why it was preserved with such care, why it was encoded in forms designed to last forever. The Anunnaki weren't just distant rulers. They were, according to these texts, the source of everything that made human civilization possible. And the teaching began before the flood, in the antediluvian age, when 7 sages walked out of the sea and taught the first cities everything they needed to know, when gods taught humans to count the sky. There's a text preserved in multiple copies from the first millennium BC, a scholarly composition that circulated among literate elites in Babylonian and Assyrian cities. It's not mythological narrative in the usual sense, no plot, no drama, just a list. But like many Mesopotamian lists, it encodes a worldview. The text is called the Uruk list of kings and sages. It pairs each of the antediluvian kings with an advisor, a sage, a teacher, 7 kings before the flood, 7 sages who counselled them. The kings are human, though with impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, numbers that scholars interpret as symbolic rather than literal. The sages are Apkallu, a Sumerian word that the Akkadian texts transliterate as Apkul, meaning sage or expert, but with connotations of supernatural knowledge and divine origin. The list begins, when kingship descended from heaven, Alulim was king in Eridu. His sage was Uana Adapa. Alulim we've met before. He's the first king listed in the Sumerian king list, ruler of Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition. But Uana Adapa is more interesting. The name combines Uana, the Sumerian form, with Adapa, the Akkadian form. And we have stories about Adapa. In the Adapa epic, preserved in fragmentary form from several sites including Ashurbanipal's library, Adapa is described as a priest of Enki in Eridu. He's called the wise one among men and credited with extraordinary knowledge, wisdom like the wisdom of E, the god of wisdom. The text says explicitly that Ea had granted him wisdom, but had not granted him eternal life. The story goes that Adapa was fishing in the Persian Gulf when the south wind capsized his boat. In anger, he cursed the wind and broke its wing, causing the south wind to stop blowing. This disruption of natural order caught the attention of the sky god Anu, who summoned Adapa to heaven to explain himself. Ea warned Adapa about the journey, told him what to say, but also warned him not to accept any food or drink offered in heaven because it would be the food and drink of death. Adapa went to heaven, gave his explanation, and Anu, impressed by his wisdom, forgave him and offered him the bread and water of life, which would have granted immortality. But Adapa, following Ea's instructions, refused. Only after he returned to earth did he learn that Ea had deliberately misled him, ensuring that humans would remain mortal even while possessing divine wisdom. This is the origin of human knowledge, according to one strand of Mesopotamian tradition. Adapa Uana received wisdom directly from E. He travelled to heaven, stood before the divine council, and returned with knowledge, but not immortality. He became the prototype of the sage, the scholar who possesses divine learning, but remains human, mortal, limited. And the Uruk list identifies him as the first Apkallu, advisor to the first king, teacher of the first city. The list continues with 6 more pairs. Alorgar was king, his sage was Uanduga, Ameluana was king, his sage was Emmeduga, Amegalana was king, his sage was Emmegalamma, Dumuzi was king, his sage was Emmebeluga, Ensibsiana was king, his sage was Aninlilda, Meduranki was king. His sage was Uchuabzu. These 7 antediluvian sages became, in later Mesopotamian tradition, the archetypal transmitters of knowledge. They taught building, mathematics, divination, ritual, agriculture, everything needed for civilization. And they were explicitly described as having divine or semi-divine origin. The Greek author Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Mesopotamia in Greek in the 3rd century BC, preserved a version of this tradition. He described the first sage, whom he called Oannes, as an amphibious creature, part fish, part human, who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught the people of Eridu. He gave them insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometric knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften human manners and humanize their lives. This is a remarkable claim. The Mesopotamians believed that civilization, writing, mathematics, architecture, law, agriculture, all of it was taught to humans by divine or semi-divine beings. It wasn't slowly developed through trial and error. It was revealed at the beginning by the Apkallu who served the Anunnaki. And crucially for our inquiry, this includes astronomical knowledge. Berossus specifically mentions that Oannes taught the principles of geometric knowledge, which in Mesopotamian context includes celestial geometry, the movements of sun, moon and stars, the calculation of calendars. This wasn't separate from other crafts. It was foundational. You needed astronomical observation to time agricultural activities, to set festival dates, to regulate the administrative calendar that governed everything from tax collection to military campaigns. But there's a problem with this story, the flood. According to every version of the Mesopotamian flood narrative, the deluge destroyed everything. Cities were swept away, humanity was nearly exterminated, the 7 sages were gone. How did their knowledge survive? The texts give different answers. In some versions, written tablets were buried before the flood and rediscovered afterward. In others, a few humans survived who had learned from the Apkallu and could teach the next generation. In the Era epic, the god Marduk claims to have preserved the knowledge himself, keeping the wisdom of the antediluvian sages even while destroying their physical civilization. But the consistent theme is that post-flood knowledge is inheritance. Nothing was newly invented after the deluge. Everything was rediscovery, restoration, connection to the antediluvian golden age when gods and humans interacted directly. This has profound implications for how we understand Mesopotamian astronomy. When Enheduanna tracked Venus, she wasn't pioneering observation. She was continuing a tradition established before the flood by the Apkallu, who had learned it from Inanna Ishtar herself. When Ashurbanipal's astronomers recorded the night sky on January 3rd, 650b, they were applying techniques passed down through 1500 years of continuous scholarly tradition, which itself looked back to the antediluvian sages as ultimate authorities. The astronomical texts make this explicit. Many tablets include colophons, closing statements that identify the scribe who copied the tablet's place in a series, and sometimes its origin, and some colophons claim divine origin for the text. One astronomical tablet from Ashurbanipal's library ends with this statement: Tablet of Anu and Enlil, which those gods had inscribed in heaven, which the great gods had revealed, not which scribes compiled from observations, not which scholars calculated, but which the gods inscribed and revealed. The knowledge came from above. Humans were preserving it, not creating it. Another colophon, from a ritual text dealing with celestial divination, states, Secret of the great gods. He who knows may show it to one who knows. He who does not know shall not see it. This marks the text as restricted knowledge, accessible only to initiated specialists. But it also marks the knowledge as divine property, entrusted to humans under conditions not freely available to all. These attitudes shaped how astronomical knowledge was preserved and transmitted. It wasn't public domain, it was sacred inheritance maintained by specific professional lineages, families of priests and scribes who passed training from generation to generation, who maintained continuity even when political powers changed, who saw themselves as guardians of wisdom granted by the Anunnaki in the deep past. And they preserved this knowledge in multiple forms: clay tablets archived in temple and palace libraries, ritual texts inscribed on stone stales, astronomical observations recorded in date-stamped diaries, mathematical tables calculating celestial positions, and, crucially for our pattern, visual representations using circular geometry. The circles weren't decorative, they were didactic tools, mnemonic devices, reference diagrams that encoded complex information in forms that could be grasped at a glance. When a student astronomer looked at a planisphere like K, 8538, they weren't just seeing stars, they were seeing the organisational scheme, the eightfold division, the way heaven was structured according to principles established by the Anunnaki and revealed to humans through the Apkallu. When a priestess commissioned a disc like Enheduanna's, she was asserting her place in that transmission lineage. She was saying, I have inherited the knowledge. I maintain the connection. I stand where the Apkallu once stood, between divine wisdom and human need. When Babylonian scholars drew the world map as a circle, they were illustrating the structure of creation itself, the ordered land surrounded by cosmic ocean, the mythological regions where divine human contact occurred, the whole system as an integrated totality. And when craftsmen carved cylinder seals with celestial symbols above earthly scenes, they were encoding the theological truth that animated their entire civilization. Authority flows from heaven to earth. Knowledge originates with the gods. Human society is valid insofar as it reflects cosmic order. But we need to be precise about what divine teaching meant in practice, because the text describe two different types of knowledge transmission, and understanding the distinction is crucial. The first type is direct revelation. A god appears to a human, speaks to them, gives them information. The Adapa story is this type. So are the flood narratives, where Ea warns Atrahasis or Uta-Napishti about the coming deluge and tells them how to build the ark. So are the various texts, where Inanna speaks to Enheduanna, where Shamash gives oracles to kings, where gods communicate through dreams and visions. This type appears in texts as narrative. It's dramatized, given context explained. We're told what the gods said, how the human responded, what the consequences were. The second type is institutional transmission, knowledge embedded in professions, preserved through apprenticeship, maintained by scribal schools and temple hierarchies. This is how most astronomical knowledge actually functioned. A student scribe didn't receive a vision from Anu. They learned to read star catalogues, to calculate intercalation schemes, to interpret omens by studying with a master astronomer who had studied with their own master, in a chain extending back centuries. But, and this is key, that institutional transmission claimed divine origin. The first astronomer in the chain had learned from an Apkallu. The first Apkallu had learned from Ea Enki, or one of the other great gods. Therefore, the knowledge being transmitted in scribal schools in the first millennium BC was the same knowledge established by divine decree at the beginning of time. This wasn't hypocrisy or fraud. It was a worldview. The Mesopotamians couldn't conceive of knowledge arising purely from human ingenuity. Their cosmology didn't allow for it. Humans were created by the gods to serve the gods, to perform necessary labour in both fields and temples. Intelligence, wisdom, technical skill, these were divine gifts, not natural human capacities. So when we look at the four circles and ask, what knowledge do they preserve? The Mesopotamian answer would be the knowledge the Anunnaki decreed, which the Apkallu transmitted, which we maintain through careful observation and faithful copying. And when we ask, why circles? Their answer would be, because cosmic order is circular, cycles returning, patterns repeating, eternal principles governing temporary events. The circle is the shape of eternity. Knowledge preserved in circular form participates in that eternity. But there's one more dimension we haven't fully explored, the mathematics of the circle itself. Because Mesopotamian culture didn't just use circles symbolically, they calculated with circles. They developed sophisticated geometric and arithmetic methods for dealing with circular motion, angular measurement, cyclical periods. And those mathematical methods reveal something surprising. The Mesopotamians understood that circles encode information more efficiently than linear formats. They knew that circular geometry allows you to represent complex periodic phenomena in compact visual form. This wasn't mysticism, it was practical mathematics applied to real observational problems. And it connects directly to why circular artifacts like our four examples could preserve astronomical and cosmological knowledge in ways that rectangular tablets couldn't. We need to look at Mesopotamian mathematics, particularly their treatment of circles, cycles, and angles, because the choice of circular forms wasn't arbitrary. It was mathematically motivated, theologically justified, and practically effective. The pattern of the 4 circles rests on mathematical foundations that the Mesopotamians believed were themselves divine, part of the cosmic order established when the Anunnaki divided heaven from earth and set the celestial bodies in their courses. The mathematics of the circle. The Mesopotamians invented sexagesimal notation, base 60 mathematics, sometime in the 3rd millennium BC. This is the system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We still use Babylonian mathematical conventions every time we check a clock or measure an angle, though most people don't realise the origin. Why base 60? The short answer is that 60 has many divisors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60. This makes fractions much easier to work with. If you're dividing land, rationing grain, calculating temple offerings, or tracking celestial positions, you need to handle fractions constantly. Base 60 allows you to express 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, 1/6, 1/10, 1/12, and many other common fractions as whole number divisions of 60. For astronomy, this was crucial. Celestial periods rarely come out to whole numbers in solar days. The moon's synodic period, new moon to new moon, is 29.53 days. Venus's synodic period, our appearance, to next evening star appearance, is 584 days. Jupiter's sidereal period, returned to the same position against background stars, is 11.86 years. You need flexible fractional arithmetic to handle these values, and sexagesimal notation provided it. But the deeper mathematical innovation was the division of the circle itself. At some point, we don't know exactly when, but probably by the late 2nd millennium BC, Mesopotamian astronomers standardized the division of the full circle into 360 equal parts. This isn't natural in the way that 4 cardinal directions or 8 sectors are natural. It's a mathematical decision, and it required justification. The justification came from the calendar. The solar year is approximately 365 days. A circle divided into 360 degrees gives you roughly 1 degree per day, close enough for practical purposes. As the sun moves through the zodiac, it travels about 1 degree per day against the background stars. The moon moves much faster, about 13 degrees per day. Planets move at their own rates. Mars might move half a degree per day, Jupiter only 5 minutes of arc per day. By measuring all of these angular motions in degrees, Mesopotamian astronomers created a unified coordinate system. They could say, on month 2, day 14, the moon was 127 degrees from the vernal equinox, Jupiter was at 45 degrees, Mars was at 203 degrees. These numbers could be recorded in tables compared across years, used to identify recurring patterns. And crucially, degrees made prediction possible. If you know Jupiter moves roughly 30 degrees per year through the zodiac, you can predict that after 12 years it will return close to its starting position, actually 11.86 years. So there's some drift, but the first order approximation holds. If you know Mars moves 191 degrees per year on average, you can calculate period relations. 37 synodic periods equals 79 years, after which Mars returns to almost exactly the same position at the same season. The Babylonians developed these period relations systematically. They had records spanning centuries. The astronomical diaries begin around 750 BC and continue into the Hellenistic period, which gave them the data needed to identify long-term cycles. And they expressed these cycles using circular geometry. Consider the zodiac itself. By the 5th century BC, possibly earlier, but this is when we have clear documentation, Babylonian astronomers had divided the ecliptic, the sun's apparent path through the stars, into 12 equal 30-degree sections. These are the zodiacal signs: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. The constellations themselves aren't equal in size. The actual star pattern we call Scorpius extends across more degrees than the star pattern we call Cancer. But the zodiacal signs are mathematical divisions, not observational star groups. They create a standardized reference frame, a circular coordinate system that allowed astronomers to record planetary positions consistently. This is sophisticated mathematical astronomy. It requires understanding that the sky can be modelled as a geometric object, that positions can be quantified numerically, that patterns can be expressed as mathematical relationships rather than purely descriptive narratives. And the Babylonians did all of this without telescopes, without mechanical clocks, without any instrumentation except naked eye observation and water clocks for rough time measurement. They tracked planetary positions to within a fraction of a degree. They predicted lunar eclipses months or years in advance. They calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the true value. How? By treating celestial motion as periodic phenomena expressible in circular mathematics. Take lunar eclipses as an example. An eclipse occurs when the moon passes through Earth's shadow, which only happens at full moon when the sun, Earth and moon are aligned. But not every full moon produces an eclipse, because the moon's orbit is tilted about 5 degrees relative to the ecliptic. Most months, the full moon passes above or below Earth's shadow. Eclipses only occur when full moon happens near one of the two nodes, the points where the moon's orbit crosses the ecliptic. The nodes themselves move, completing a full cycle in 18.6 years. This creates a complex pattern where eclipses happen in roughly 6-month intervals when the sun is near one node, then 6 months later near the other node, but the pattern shifts gradually over decades. Babylonian astronomers discovered that after 223 lunar months, about 18 years and 11 days, the eclipse pattern repeats almost exactly. This is the Saros cycle. If there's a lunar eclipse today, there will likely be another eclipse one Saros later, at almost the same lunar node, at almost the same distance from Earth, producing an eclipse of similar duration and appearance. The Saros cycle is pure circular mathematics. The moon's orbital node makes 242 complete circles in the time the moon makes 223 synodic cycles. The slight difference creates the 18-year pattern. Babylonian astronomers didn't understand the mechanism, they didn't know about Earth's shadow or orbital mechanics, but they identified the cycle through careful record keeping and circular reasoning. If this pattern happened 18 years ago, it will happen again now. They applied the same method to planetary phenomena. Venus, as mentioned, has an 8-year cycle. After 8 years, Venus returns to almost the same position on almost the same calendar date. The Babylonians noticed this and used it for prediction. If Venus was visible in the morning in year 1, it would be visible in the morning again in year 9, 17, 25, and so on. Jupiter and Saturn have longer cycles, but the principle is the same. Track positions over decades, identify the periods, use circular mathematics to predict future positions. Now, here's where this connects to our 4 circular artifacts. When Enheduanna tracked Venus, she was observing a circular phenomenon. Venus's orbit around the Sun, though she didn't conceptualize it that way, creates a circular pattern in the sky. Her hymns encoding this knowledge weren't arbitrary poetry. They were mnemonic devices preserving cyclical information. And when she commissioned a circular disc to commemorate her authority, she was using the geometric form that best represented the cyclical nature of her work. When Ashurbanipal's astronomer created the planisphere K8538, they were representing the circular celestial dome in 2 dimensions. The eightfold division wasn't decorative, it was a coordinate system, a way of organising angular positions. The tablet encoded positional information that could be cross-referenced with numerical tables to calculate star positions on other nights. When Babylonian scholars drew the world map as a circle, they were applying the same circular thinking to geography. The world had a centre, a radius, the extent of known lands, and a circumference, the Bitter River. Beyond that, mathematically speaking, lay regions that couldn't be mapped linearly because they weren't part of ordinary space. They were mythological extensions, like the complex plane extending beyond the real number line in mathematics. And when VA 243 showed celestial symbols in roughly circular arrangement above an earthly scene, it was encoding the same cosmological structure, a circular heaven above, with divine authority radiating outward from a central source, witnessed by the surrounding host. The circle was information technology. It was how you preserved periodic knowledge in static form. It was how you represented totality in finite space. It was how you connected the observable pars to Ne with the eternal, the cosmic order established by the Anunnaki. But the mathematical sophistication required to do this effectively shouldn't be underestimated. The Mesopotamians didn't just look at the sky and draw pictures. They developed coordinate systems for angular measurement, period relations for planetary cycles, interpolation schemes for calculating intermediate values, arithmetic progressions for lunar velocity which changes as the moon orbits elliptically, zigzag functions for modelling solar motion through the seasons, intercalation rules for keeping lunar and solar calendars aligned. All of this required institutional support. You couldn't develop mathematical astronomy as a lone genius. You needed scribal schools where students spent years mastering numerical tables. You needed temple observatories where astronomers recorded data night after night across decades. You needed palace patronage to support non-productive specialists. You needed archives where tablets from previous generations were kept accessible. And you needed the theological framework that justified all of this effort. Why spend decades tracking Jupiter's position? Because Jupiter is Marduk, king of the gods, and his movements reveal divine intentions for earthly affairs. Why calculate lunar eclipses years in advance? Because eclipses are ominous, signs of divine displeasure, warnings that require ritual response to avert disaster. Why preserve astronomical texts in library archives? Because this knowledge came from the Apkallu, who learned it from the Anunnaki, and losing it would sever humanity's connection to cosmic order. The mathematics and the theology were inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other. The circles preserved both simultaneously mathematical precision encoded in geometric form, theological truth expressed through mathematical regularity. This brings us to the final question we need to address before we can step back and consider three different ways of reading all this evidence. The question is, how did astronomical observation actually work in practice? We've talked about texts, about mathematical schemes, about theological frameworks, but there were real people on real temple roofs during real nights watching the sky. What did that look like? What did they do? How did observation become archive? Because that process, observation to record to preservation to interpretation, is what the four circles ultimately represent. They're endpoints of observational practice, material artifacts that preserve what once was living knowledge maintained by professional astronomers. We need to go to the temples, to the observatories, to the scribal schools. We need to see how someone became an astronomer priest in Mesopotamia, what training they received, what tools they used, what their working life was like. Because the circles didn't draw themselves. They were created by specific people with specific expertise in specific institutional contexts. And understanding those contexts is crucial for evaluating the theological claims embedded in the circles, that this knowledge came from the gods, that it connected human observers to cosmic order, that it fulfilled a sacred function established when kingship descended from heaven, from temple to tablet. Imagine it's the 7th century BC. You are 12 years old, the child of a scribe in Babylon, born into a family that has served the temple of Marduk for generations. Your father and grandfather were both Tupar Emanu Enlil, scribes of the Celestial Omen series, specialists in astronomical divination. Your family's house sits in the shadow of the great Ziggurat et Anunnaki, where each morning you watch priests ascend the stairway to perform sunrise rituals at the highest shrine. You've known since you could walk that you would follow your father's profession, not because you chose it, but because knowledge is inheritance. Your father owns tablets, actual clay tablets, kept in a locked wooden chest, worth more than the house itself. These tablets contain observation logs going back 3 generations, tables of planetary positions, copies of important omen texts, calculation procedures that took him a decade to master. When you turn 12, your formal education begins. Not in a public school, those don't exist for specialized knowledge, but in the temple scribal school attached to the Esagila, the temple complex of Marduk. Every morning before dawn, you walk through the dark streets to the temple district, entering through the lesser gate reserved for personnel, making your way to a long, narrow room with benches along the walls and a clay-top table in the centre. Your teacher is Umme, a master scholar, a man in his 50s who can read both Sumerian and Akkadian fluently, who has memorized vast sections of the Celestial Omen series, who has spent 30 years watching the sky and recording what he sees. He is not warm or encouraging. He doesn't believe in praise. He expects perfection because anything less will corrupt the knowledge you're supposed to inherit. For the first 2 years, you learn cuneiform writing, not just basic sign recognition, but the complex Akkadian syllabary, how to write astronomical terms, how to form numbers in sexagesimal notation, how to abbreviate standard phrases, how to prepare clay tablets of the right consistency. You write on soft clay with a reed stylus, practicing the same signs hundreds of times until they're automatic. Your hands develop calluses where you grip the stylus. You memorize star lists: Mul, Mul, Mul Gam, Mul Shu, Gi, Old Man, Mul Urgula, Leon. Each constellation has multiple names: Sumerian, Akkadian, sometimes Elamite loan words. You learn which constellations rise at which seasons, which are circumpolar or oblique, which are near the ecliptic where planets move. You learn the planets and their periods. Mulbabar takes 12 years to complete the zodiac. Kaimanu takes 30 years. Delabat has its complex 8-year cycle with morning and evening appearances. You memorize tables in year 1. Venus first visible in east on day X, visible for Y days, disappeared, reappeared in west on day Z. These aren't just facts, they're patterns you'll need to recognize during observations. Around age 14 you begin going to the temple roof for actual observations. The first few times you simply watch while your teacher and senior students work. They arrive an hour before sunrise, when the eastern sky is still dark enough to see stars, but dawn is approaching. They have clay tablets prepared the day before, ready for fresh marks. They have a water clock, a vessel with a small hole that drips at a constant rate, crude but functional for rough time measurement. The senior student points Venus. Measure its angular distance from the moon. Your teacher holds up a measuring rod marked with divisions, uses his hand with fingers extended to estimate angles, a method called hand widths, roughly standardized across observers, 3 degrees, 2/3 of a degree to the south. Another student presses cuneiform marks into the tablet. Month V, day 27, Venus was 3 degrees south of the moon in the Lion constellation. This is observational astronomy. No instruments except eyes, hands, and measuring rods. No precision optics. But with practice, trained observers can estimate angular separations to within a fraction of a degree. And when you have records spanning decades or centuries, small errors average out. The patterns become clear. You learn to identify planets by their behaviour. Stars maintain fixed positions relative to each other. Planets move, but each at its own rate. Jupiter inches eastward night by night. Mars sometimes moves quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes reverses direction tree motion, caused by Earth overtaking Mars in its orbit. Though Mesopotamian astronomers didn't know the mechanism, they just recorded the phenomenon. Venus is never far from the Sun, always appearing in evening or morning twilight, never visible at midnight. You learn the importance of eclipses. Once or twice a year, the schedule shifts. Your teacher warns days in advance. Lunar eclipse possible on the 15th. Everyone adjusts their routine. On the predicted night, multiple observers gather. If clouds obscure the moon, a constant problem in observational astronomy, the observation is lost. But if the sky is clear and the eclipse occurs, you record everything: exact time of first contact, duration of totality, colour of the eclipsed moon, red, dark grey, various shades depending on Earth's atmospheric conditions, time of final contact. These observations go to the king. Within days, a messenger carries tablets to the palace. Court diviners interpret the omen. What does this eclipse mean for the king, for the city, for the harvest? Should rituals be performed to avert threatened disaster? The astronomy and the politics are inseparable. By age 16, you're recording observations yourself. You have your own tablet, prepared each evening for the next morning session. You've learned the standardized format: date first year of King X, month Y, day Z, then celestial phenomena in order: moon position, planetary positions, notable stars, then any unusual events: comet, eclipse, aurora, rare but recorded when they occur. You copy these raw observation tablets into master logs. This is crucial work because individual observations are valuable, but patterns only emerge across time. Your family's 3-generation archive contains observation logs going back to your great-grandfather's time. When combined with similar archives from other observer families, this creates a dataset spanning centuries. From these datasets, the patterns that generated the mathematical astronomy emerged. By your early 20s, you're a full Tupar, a professional scribe astronomer. You continue nightly observations, but you also begin studying the interpretive texts, the omen series that connects celestial events to terrestrial outcomes. You memorize key omens. If Mars approaches Scorpius, the king will suppress rebellion. If Jupiter stands still in Taurus, abundant harvest. If lunar eclipse occurs in Taurus or Scorpius during Nisan, the king of Akkad will die. These sound arbitrary to modern ears, but they're based on correlational patterns identified over centuries. Whether they represented genuine predictive power, confirmation bias, or self-fulfilling prophecy is debatable, but the Babylonians took them seriously. Kings timed military campaigns based on these omens. When unfavourable configurations appeared, substitute king rituals might be performed. A commoner installed as temporary king for a few days, then executed, allowing the bad omen to be fulfilled without harming the real king. You also learn computational astronomy. By the late Babylonian period, Vith through 1st century Stray, astronomers had developed sophisticated mathematical models. Instead of needing nightly observations, you could calculate planetary positions using arithmetic schemes. For the moon, they developed System A and System B, 2 different computational methods using zigzag functions to model the moon's variable speed. A zigzag function works like this. Start with a value, say, moon's daily motion is 13 degrees. Next day, add a fixed amount, perhaps 0.1 degree. Continue adding until you reach a maximum, say, 14 degree. Then subtract the fixed amount each day until you reach a minimum, say, 12 degrees. Then start adding again. This creates a sawtooth pattern that approximates the moon's actual variable speed as it moves from perigee to apogee in its elliptical orbit. The Babylonians didn't know why the moon's speed varies. They didn't have a theory of elliptical orbits, but they could model the variation empirically, and their models were accurate enough for prediction. A well-trained astronomer could calculate the moon's position 6 months ahead to within a degree or two of its actual position. Impressive for ancient science and sufficient for calendrical purposes. All of this knowledge, observational, computational, interpretive, was preserved in tablets that were archived in temple libraries. The tablets were copied when they became too worn to read easily. Each copy included a colophon identifying the scribe, the date of copying, and often a statement like copied from an old tablet or collated against multiple sources. This is how knowledge transmission actually worked. Not through mystical revelation, though scribes believed their knowledge ultimately traced to divine origin, but through apprenticeship, observation, record keeping, pattern recognition, and careful copying. Now, within this practical context, what did it mean to create a circular astronomical artifact like the planisphere K8538? It meant creating a teaching tool, a circular diagram that a master astronomer could use to explain the eightfold division of heaven, to show students how constellations relate spatially, to provide a visual complement to the numerical tables they were memorizing. It was a snapshot, not useful for precise calculation, but useful for conceptual understanding. The disk of Enheduanna served a similar but different function. It wasn't a teaching tool, it was a legitimacy claim. It said, I, Enheduanna, have the authority to perform these rituals, to observe these phenomena, to speak to the gods. The circular form emphasized the eternal nature of her authority. This wasn't a one-time event, but an ongoing role in cosmic order. The Babylonian world map was cosmological reference, showing students and scholars how geographical and mythological spaces related. It was saying, this is the structure of the world, Babylon at the centre, known lands within the circle, mythological regions beyond, the flood mountain in a northern nag, everything ordered, everything in its place. And VA 243, whatever specific meaning its owner intended, was personal religious expression. It said, I worship the gods, I recognise cosmic hierarchy, my transactions are witnessed by heaven. The circular seal creating circular impressions embodied the idea that divine order encompasses human activity. But all four of these circles were created by people who believed, genuinely believed, that their knowledge came from above. They weren't skeptics going through the motions. They were sincere participants in a worldview where the Anunnaki had established cosmic order, where divine beings had taught the first sages, where astronomical observation was religious duty, where maintaining accurate records honoured the gods who had made observation possible. From their perspective, watching the sky wasn't secular science, it was ritual participation in cosmic order. Recording observations wasn't data collection, it was preserving the testimony of divine activity. Creating circular diagrams wasn't cartography or graphic design, it was encoding eternal truth in geometric form that reflected celestial reality. This sincerity matters because it means the circles can't be dismissed as cynical priestcraft or deliberate deception. The people who made these artifacts believed what they were expressing. They might have been wrong about the nature of celestial bodies, wrong about divine beings, wrong about cosmic structure, but they weren't lying. They were preserving, as faithfully as they could, the knowledge they had inherited and the observations they had made within a cosmological framework they accepted as true. So now we reach the question that's been implicit throughout this entire investigation. How do we interpret this evidence? What do the 4 circles actually tell us about Mesopotamian civilization, about the relationship between astronomy and theology, about the nature of knowledge preservation in pre-scientific cultures? There are 3 main readings, 3 ways of making sense of the pattern we've traced. Each has strengths, each has limitations, and each implies something different about how we should understand ancient people's claims about divine knowledge. We need to examine all 3 carefully without prejudging which is correct, because the evidence itself, the 4 circles, the astronomical texts, the theological framework, the observational practices, is compatible with multiple interpretations. The question isn't what the evidence proves, but what it suggests. And the answer isn't simple. It never is with ancient cultures. But that's why the circles are still worth examining 4,000 years after the first one was carved. 3 readings of 4 circles. The evidence sits before us. 4 circular artifacts spanning nearly 2 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. Enheduanna's alabaster disc from 2300 BC asserting priestly authority under divine sanction. The planisphere K8538 from 650 BC mapping the night sky in 8 sectors. The Babylonian world map from 600-500 BC showing geography and mythology as a unified circle. Cylinder seal VA243 from the Akkadian period depicting earthly worship beneath celestial symbols. Surrounding these artifacts, thousands of cuneiform tablets containing astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, celestial omens, mythological narratives, ritual instructions, and embedded throughout repeated claims that this knowledge came from the Anunnaki, that it was transmitted by the Apkallu sages, that human astronomers were preserving divine revelation rather than discovering natural law. How do we make sense of this? 3 interpretive frameworks offer different answers. Reading 1, Mythology and Symbol. The first reading treats the Anunnaki and their supposed knowledge transmission as mythology, sophisticated, culturally important, but ultimately fictional. According to this reading, Mesopotamians developed astronomy through observation and calculation, just as we'd expect. They noticed that celestial bodies move in regular patterns. They recorded these patterns over centuries. They developed mathematical methods to predict future positions. All of this was human achievement, human ingenuity, human science at an early stage. But because they lacked the conceptual frameworks we have, heliocentrism, gravity, orbital mechanics, astrophysics, they understood their observations through available categories. Theology. The gods controlled celestial bodies because gods were the causal explanation for everything. Patterns repeated because the divine will was consistent. Knowledge came from revelation because Mesopotamians had no concept of knowledge arising purely from human observation. The circles in this reading are symbolic. Enheduanna's disc symbolizes her priestly authority. The planisphere K. 8538 is a practical star chart with religious overtones. The world map expresses cultural identity, Babylon at the centre of Mesopotamian identity, mythological regions acknowledging limits of geographical knowledge. VA243 uses conventional religious iconography. None of them preserve secret knowledge or document actual divine human contact. Reading 2. Practical tools and institutional memory. The second reading doesn't deny the religion, but it doesn't treat the circles as primarily mystical messages either. It treats them as compression devices, early information technology, visual formats built to do one thing exceptionally well, store a lot of complex cyclical data in a small, durable surface. In this reading, the circle is chosen for the same reason we still use circular graphs, clock faces, and compasses, because cycles are easier to grasp when you can see the whole loop at once. Enheduanna's disc becomes a credential, a permanent portable assertion that the ritual chain is intact, not a star map, but a stamped guarantee that the human at the altar is authorized to keep the cosmic schedule synchronized. The planisphere becomes a working diagram, not for the public, but for trained specialists, a visual reference supporting a much larger numerical tradition sitting behind it. The world map becomes a teaching schema, the known world, the mythic margins, the cosmic ocean, all arranged for memorization, recitation, and institutional continuity. And the cylinder seal becomes a micro-contract with the cosmos. Every administrative act is stamped inside a worldview where heaven witnesses, hierarchy matters, and order must be maintained. Under this reading, the Anunnaki language is not dismissed as childish fantasy, it is treated as the formal idiom of Mesopotamian scholarship. Like medieval Europe, speaking in theological terms while building mathematical calendars. Like early modern scientists writing physics in the language of natural philosophy. You can be rigorous, empirical, and deeply religious at the same time, because the culture never separated those categories. So the circles aren't evidence of aliens, and they aren't just art. They're a professional culture leaving behind interfaces, ways of seeing, organising and transmitting knowledge in a world where paper doesn't exist, printing doesn't exist, and the only reliable storage device is baked clay and carved stone. And that reading explains something important, why the circles feel strangely consistent across centuries. Because the institutions that trained scribes and astronomer priests were consistent, the temples remained, the scribal lineages remained. Even when empires changed flags, the sky didn't change its cycles, and neither did the need to encode them. But then there's a third reading, and this is where the story gets dangerous. Not because it proves something sensational, but because it forces you to confront what ancient people themselves claimed with unsettling clarity. Because some texts don't merely say the gods rule the sky, they say in effect, we did not invent this, we inherited it, it was given. And that claim, whether you believe it or not, changes how you hear the silence behind the artifacts. Reading 3, claimed revelation, we were taught. The third reading takes the Mesopotamian claim at face value, not as fact we can verify, but as a self-report repeated so often, so formally, and so institutionally that we can't reduce it to a metaphor without losing the plot. Under this framework, the circles are not merely symbolic and not merely practical. They are proof objects, material witnesses that say, this order is real, this knowledge is authorized, this transmission chain is legitimate. Because the Mesopotamians didn't just believe the gods existed, they believed knowledge has a pedigree. They believed there was a time, before the flood, before the dynasties, before the scribal schools, when the boundary between divine and human was thinner and certain figures crossed it. Not poets, not philosophers, sages, apkallu, mediators, people who were close enough to the divine realm to receive what later generations would only preserve. So the circle becomes more than a convenient shape. It becomes a seal of completeness, a declaration that what's inside it is not provisional human guesswork, but a closed system, a totality, the whole pattern in this reading. Enheduanna isn't just a priestess. She's a node in a transmission line claiming direct sanction from the highest tier of reality. K8538 isn't just a diagram, it's a snapshot of the sky as legal testimony, the heavens on a given night, recorded so the court of the gods can be interpreted properly. The world map isn't a geographic doodle, it's cosmology drawn as jurisdiction, where order applies, where myth begins, where the edges of the human realm touch the places of divine action. VA243 isn't a solar system, it's something arguably more revealing, a personal stamp that says, my authority happens under that canopy. Not astronomy, cosmic accountability. And here's the critical point. Even if you personally believe none of this is literally true, the internal logic is coherent. If the cosmos is governed by a council, and the sky is the council's visible display, then astronomy becomes not just science, but divine reading. And the circle becomes the ideal container, because the sky is a dome, time is cyclical, and decree must return again and again, like the moon, like Venus, like the seasons, like kingship itself, moving city to city, dynasty to dynasty, always descending, always transferring, always coming down. So the third reading doesn't ask you to believe in Anunnaki astronauts. It asks you something subtler. It asks, what does it mean that the oldest continuous scholarly tradition on Earth insisted for 2,000 years that its knowledge was inherited from above, not once, not in one strange tablet, but as a repeated professional identity? So which reading is right? Here's the honest answer. The artifacts themselves don't force only one conclusion. Reading 1 explains the symbols. Reading 2 explains the function. Reading 3 explains the obsession, the emotional seriousness, the secrecy language, the fixation on lineage, the sense that knowledge is not owned by humans but held in trust. And if you're listening carefully, you realise the script has been guiding you to a final move, not to pick one reading like a verdict, but to notice that all three can be true at once, at different levels, because an ancient culture can build practical predictive astronomy, 2, express it in divine language, Tall Jing 1, and still sincerely experience it as revealed inheritance, 3. That's not contradiction. That's how civilizations actually work. And now we reach the last chapter, the one that doesn't try to prove anything, the one that returns to the museum cases, the dim lighting, the labels, the quiet distance between you and the people who made these objects. Because the circles don't just preserve data, they preserve a human posture toward the cosmos, the posture of people who believed the universe was readable, because someone, somewhere, intended it to be read. What circles remember? Before you turn this video off, I want you to picture the 4 circles again, not as artifacts, but as 4 frozen moments in a single long attempt to hold the sky still. In Philadelphia, Enheduanna's disk sits under glass, alabaster catching museum light the way it once caught torchlight. You can still see the procession, the altar, the priestess with the end crown, the name pressed into permanence, a human being insisting, across 5,000 years I stood here, I was authorised, the connection was real. In London, in the British Museum, K8538 survives as broken clay, but not broken meaning. 8 sectors radiate outward like a clock face without numbers, a night sky pinned down, not poetry, not myth. A date you can verify with modern software, carved by someone who didn't know they were building the oldest surviving moment of the heavens. A few rooms away, the world map compresses geography and theology into one small circle. Babylon in the centre, the cosmic ocean around it, outer regions like teeth or rays pushing beyond the boundary. A message hidden in plain sight. The world is not only where we walk, there are edges, and beyond those edges are stories that claim to be memories. And in Berlin, VA243 waits behind its controversy like a quiet witness at the back of a courtroom. Whether you see planets or not, it still does what seals were meant to do. It repeats. Again and again. It stamps the same relationship into clay, the human below, the divine above, and the sky as the silent authority that makes the whole scene legitimate. 4 circles. 4 attempts to preserve the same conviction in different languages. Stone, clay, map, seal. And maybe that's the real point. Not whether the Anunnaki were real, in the way modern people mean real, but that the people who built the first cities on Earth behaved as if the cosmos had administrators, and as if the sky was their archive. Because a circle is the one shape that never points to an end. It returns. The moon returns. Venus returns. Seasons return. Kingship descends and moves and descends again. Empires burn, and the fire bakes the tablets, and the knowledge survives by accident. And you, right now, are part of that return. A modern mind staring at an ancient shape, feeling that strange pressure that only certain objects create, the sense that someone long dead was not merely decorating clay, but trying to send something forward. So when you hear the claim, knowledge came down from heaven, don't rush to accept it or dismiss it. Just notice how hard they worked to preserve it, how carefully they encoded it, how often they chose the circle when the message was most important. Because circles don't just represent the world, they represent the desire to make order permanent. And whatever else these artifacts are, ritual credentials, star charts, myth maps, administrative seals, they are also this: proof that the first astronomers in human history believed the universe could be read, and proof that they believed what they read mattered enough to outlast them. The circles are still waiting, in museum archives, in catalogue numbers, in quiet display cases, not because they're mysterious, but because they're unfinished. They were made to be read again. If you've made it this far, comment one word, circle, and tell me where you're listening from, because 5,000 years ago, someone in looked up at the same sky you're under tonight and believed it was speaking. Good night.